So I'm going to kind of quickly run through my work that I've done with black currants and kind of just a little background on black currants in general, since they're not really too common here in the US. So this was my field crew this past season with a bunch of currants that we harvested with a machine. And so just a little bit about myself. Bill already kind of filled in, but I did my master's work using shade netting to kind of see how well black currants produce under shade. And now I'm currently working with black currants, red currants, and white currants across Illinois and Wisconsin. And so a lot of people ask me, why did I get into currants? My background came in from fermentable woody crops. So I came from working with grapes down in Southern Illinois, and I have since moved on to all sorts of other fun little projects, peaches, apples, currants, grapes, and the like. And then the other question is, why are we growing black currants at the U of I, the University of Illinois? And so that's what I came in on, was because they said, okay, we are looking for a berry expert to work in our agroforestry for food projects. And so the idea here is that we're trying to mix together a bunch of woody crops. Chestnuts, hazelnuts, and black currants are kind of the primary focus we have right now, as well as apples and raspberries. And we're trying to find ways of growing those all together in polycultures, which is the mix of food and other crops just grown together. So that can be anything from growing a cover crops underneath corn, all the way to like this system here, which is soybeans in between evergreens for timber, with our idea that we're trying to get multifunctionality. And so we're moving from a very basic monoculture system over into these polyculture systems, and we're trying to get more closed loop systems as well. And so that brings us to currants. What are currants? Currants are a crop that have been around for a few hundred years now, with evidence of them going back to the 11th century as a actual plant that was being grown instead of just being wildly harvested. But it was mainly a medicinal crop. The berries are very nutritious, as we'll get to in a little bit here. And they, the nice thing about them now is at this point they can be machine harvested or hand picked, and they make excellent processed foods. And for our agroforestry systems, we had a great interest in them because they're shade tolerant. So they're native to Northern Europe and Asia. At least the Ribes nigrum, the black currant that we tend to eat. However, there is a American black currant, Ribes americanum, but we won't really discuss that one as it hasn't really reached any sort of commercial viability yet. In the 1940s, the British government really promoted it during World War II as a very highly nutritious way of getting their vitamin C, while there were some embargoes with citrus fruits. And they were popular here in the US until about the 1920s due to a disease. So black currants are known for their very high levels of vitamin C, about 3 times that of an orange. And they also have high in polyphenols, which we are interested in because they're antioxidants. They have really a lot of medical benefits that we're learning. And they're a very unique tasting berry as well. If you've never tasted a black currant, you're missing out, I guess I will say. And if you have tasted a black currant, you probably will never forget that taste. So I'm just going to briefly cover just a couple other of the berries in the currant family, while the rest of the presentation will pretty much be about black currants, since as we'll get over into a little more detail, they tend to be a little bit more commercially viable for the Midwest. But that being said, the red and white currants are the same family. This is actually a really nice picture I found in our fields of some of the white currants reverting back to having color in their pigments. So they are the same. The only difference is that one was selected to not have pigments and the other ones were. They don't have quite the nutritional benefits that the black currants do, but they are still very nutritious. They still have a good source of vitamin C and vitamin A. but they are very tender berries, so they don't really store as long, and you have to use hand picking. There are some new varieties out there with a little bit thicker skin, but that they're able to use for machine harvest. But primarily, these are a hand-picked crop that work really well with trellising. The other one in the family, actually, it's called the gooseberry family, are the gooseberries. And so here's a nice good picture of those gooseberries. They have these nice long, thick berries. And I wish I was looking around for pictures. I tried to have my mom send me some pictures of them. They are one of the craziest looking fruit. They have a really thin flesh on them that you can see the seeds on the inside. And they have everything from red, yellow, white, and green. But they are very drooping and they're very thorny. And so they make them, they're kind of a beast to hand harvest. You have to kind of get gloves on, but they also do really well with trellising. And this is actually on a trellis wire, so you can kind of see on the top there. And so with trellising, they can make a good crop as well. The last one is jostaberry. I have never seen one in my life, so you guys don't get a picture of it. It's a hybrid plant though, with the black currant and then also the North American black gooseberry and the European gooseberry. And these produce a nice larger black berry, like the black currant, but larger in size, more like a gooseberry. They can be pretty hardy and they can grow quite well. But as I mentioned, I have yet to use them and I haven't really seen too many around. So how are black currants used? They're most commonly used for processing. Across Europe, about 90%, 95% is going to be processed. Occasionally, you see them eaten fresh. You'll find them used in pastries a lot, but they're using preserves or frozen berries for that. The leaves can be used into teas, and the buds can also be used in a health supplement. And in some areas, you'll find that might be, have a good idea of what black currants are. You'll find them as a flavoring because they are a very unique flavor. And so as my friend from South Korea sent this over, he had found some black currant flavored mints. And I was like, yay. So here's some other additional products though. Like this is from Amazon, Botanical Beauty. And so this is a blackcurrant seed oil. The seed oil has high levels of gamma-linolenic acid, which is found to be very healthy for you. And so there's a lot of other products that you can get from black currants other than just the berries. But for the rest of this remainder of this presentation, we'll just be focusing on the important part, the berries. And so here's a really cool picture. This is our extracts we did before we did some of our analyses of just the color range that you get from black currants to white currants to pink currants to red currants. They're very, very dense in color, particularly the black currants, and are it's a very shelf-stable color compared to something like elderberry or even blueberry. The types of coloring that they have is a nice, stable, long-term color, which is very nice for products such like a yogurt that you want to maintain a good color for. Here's just a little bit of a nutrient profiles. Honestly, just know that they're healthy. So if you want to see my slides afterwards, by all means, but they blow everything out of the water. I mean, anthocyanin content alone is higher than blueberries. Very high in calcium and iron as well, and vitamin A and vitamin C. And so, like I mentioned, black currants, they had a disease, and this disease caused them, by the 1920s, we had about 7,400 acres of currants being grown. And then shortly after that, they got banned in the US. And it wasn't until 1966 that this nationwide ban was lifted. And in some states, it's actually still either illegal or you have to have a permit to grow them. So they've had a slow reintroduction. And that disease was white pine blister rust. And so the issue was that they didn't really care about the currants having the disease. They were concerned about white pines. It's a fatal disease to white pines. And especially in the early 1900s, white pine was a really common and popular timber crop. But by the 60s, they'd already discovered better silviculture practices. So ways of actually growing the trees that didn't require as much termination of their currant family. And here's just kind of a little very rudimentary map I put together. And actually I messed it up. Michigan there should be yellow, but it's still banned. And if you can think about this from a logging standpoint, it's in these sort of northern regions with excessive logging still involved that they will have restrictions, either on growing them at all, like Virginia, or having restrictions on what can be permitted. And so, like in Michigan, you can get a permit to grow black currants, but they have to be only a certain varieties that have been shown to have resistance. And that's kind of an issue because we have had some new releases out that in Michigan you're not still able to grow because we're still in the process of getting those evaluated for disease resistance. But if you're in any other part of these green parts, by all means, you should be planting out currants. And here's a good picture of that disease, that white pine blister rust. Here on the right, you see it on the leaves. It shows up on the bottom of the leaves of the black currants. And on the left is from the U.S. Forest Service, just a picture of the white pine blister rust, those pustules that form on the tree itself. And so when you start seeing it at this stage, your tree's dead. It's hit the stems. But we won't go over that. So it will travel up to 300 miles from infected trees to currants. So if you plant currants and anywhere in your region has a tree that's infected, your plants could get it. But fortunately, the currant to the white pine distance is only about 1,000 yards. So if you were to plant them out and you have white pines nearby, it's something to keep an eye on. Our trials here at the U of I actually have white pines that are a stone's throw away. And so we've been kind of using those as just a, I guess, canary in the mines kind of thing to see if we see any movement to the trees. And I guess I would say that the fact that I don't have my own picture here of the trees is a sign that I haven't found it yet, but we haven't seen it on the trees. There's environmental limitations, and so it doesn't really seem to grow as well on the trees down in the south here. And there's plenty of options for the currants to keep the disease from gaining foothold, particularly using mineral oil later in the season. But the best option is to just plant varieties that are resistant, which is not hard to find. So I guess now I'm going to get into the kind of the culture of black currants here. And so I guess the first one that for us in central Illinois, and we had some trials in southern Illinois that we quickly discovered was not practical, is that here in the US, we are actually at the southern, especially in central Illinois, we're at the southern extent of where black currants are grown. And so if you look at them in Europe, they're typically grown in like the Netherlands, the UK, Scandinavia, or Poland. And we're at the latitude more similar to what would be Italy. And so that lower range, we're definitely kind of encroaching upon a lot of angry currents. And so here you can see we had temperatures this year in the 90s during harvest, and it just completely softened the berries and made them unusable for consumption. I had some really good notes here that I included about the tasting like applesauce, which if you've eaten a black currant, they shouldn't taste like applesauce. And so the other side of that is the cold. They do like to flower early. We're already in full bloom right now. And so the past couple of days when we had those 28-degree nights, we were a little bit concerned about our currant flowers. And fortunately ours pulled through, but they can start getting damaged just like apples, just like peaches, from those early blooming varieties with those late frosts and freezes that we get. But we do get a lot of sunburn. And here you can also kind of see on that leaf, sort of that copper look. And that's the sunburn. The leaves start to flag. They really don't like the heat. So that's one of our things that we're working on, and why the shade trials have been really nice to look at is to kind of get an idea of what can we do to mitigate these risks. And so currants really like a nice, well-drained soil, and they like a lower pH, 5.5 to 7. And so we've had some issues here in some of our sites in central Illinois when we're planting in what was existing corn and bean fields. with all the lime that the farmers will put down, our pHs sometimes get above 7.5 to 8. And we also have issues with drainage here, which we have done a pretty good job of providing tillage. You can plant into areas that have drainage tile underneath, or you can also plant them into rows, hilled rows like you might see with blueberries. And so we've done some trials with that to see how well they perform. And so far it seems like a nice mitigation strategy if you're concerned with the soil drainage. They can grow well in the north and northeast facing slopes. It will help them not flower as early in the season, which is sort of another advantage if you do have issues with those late freezes. And if you have not as good of conditions, adding in organic matter both above the soil with wood mulch, and then also really trying to cover crop before planting and tilling that cover in can really help provide a nice looseness in the soil and the high organic matter that these plants really like. For fertility, currants are very hungry plants. They, once they're mature, will take up to 100 pounds nitrogen per acre, which is quite a bit. It's not like an apple or a grape where you're really trying to reduce fertility. We're removing up to 90% of the biomass every year, depending on how lush the growth is coming. And so we have to replace that. And we replace that with a lot of nitrogen and a fair amount of phosphorus and potassium. But slow release fertilizers are kind of your best options. A really healthy placement of compost can be really nice, but you can also just use something like some basic urea. And it helps then if you're using something like urea or some of the quicker conventional fertilizers to do half applications or even a quarter application in the early spring, followed by a little bit heavier application about May time. And you can also fertigate. That's not a bad option. You can use stuff like fish emulsion to give them a fertigation because they do like irrigation. And at planting, we tend to try to plant those as early in the spring as we possibly can. As soon as that soil can be worked in March and April, they're ready to go in the ground. The biggest issue is actually planting too late. If they get into mid to late May, we'll start to get, and especially with us being in central Illinois and the heat, they really do not like that. They like to be nice and well rooted well before going into the hot points of the summer. So we try to get our plants in the ground, yeah, like I said, as soon as possible. And even what we'll do sometimes is while pruning in the late winter, early spring, we'll actually take cuttings and fill in gaps right as we're doing our pruning, because the currants, they grow incredibly well from cuttings. You can buy them as rooted cuttings, but we've had incredible success with just using literal pruning sticks, about 8 inches long, and putting those in the ground about 6 inches, leaving about 2 inches above the ground. And we don't have to worry about picking the buds off. We can just stick them in the ground and they'll just grow. Red and white currants will have a little bit more difficulty with rooting out, but the black currants have been, I mean, remarkably easy. And our spacing, if you're going to be using machine harvest, you want to have at least 12 feet in between the rows, because otherwise the plants, you just won't be able to get through the rows there. But if you're doing a hand harvest, if you're doing something like a U-pick, 8 feet should be sufficient. You just want to make sure you have enough space to get down the rows when the plants really start to reach maturity there. And in between the rows, or in between, like in row, you want them usually 3 to 6 feet if you're just growing them as individual shrubs. If you want to be doing hand picking, that makes them incredibly easy to hand pick then. Whereas one of the more common, if you're trying to do this at a production scale, large scale production, about a 1.5 feet is actually what you do for planting, and it forms this really nice hedgerow. And those hedgerows are great for the mechanical harvesters, for our pneumatic harvesters, as well as allows you to start doing some other pruning alternatives like coppicing. And so when you plant them, this is if you're planting in the bare roots. You want to make sure that you're planting them lower into the ground, kind of like a rose bush, so you really get that crown to form. We've had issues with planting bare roots where we planted them too high, and they start to form in the single stem, which is really pretty for the first couple years. until that stem wants to die and we don't have another stem there to rejuvenate it. And so I would actually even argue that there's no such thing as probably too deep that you see on the right there for the currants. They tend to turn those lower buds like a raspberry does into roots, so or into new shoots. And so really your biggest concern is planting too high. And flowering is also another, as I was mentioning about the freeze can be an issue, but the other issue is if it doesn't get cold enough in the winter. They need 800 to 1600 chilling hours below 7 degrees Celsius, which is about 40 something degrees. And so that's where we've also had some issues in like the lower climates, more southern climates, that they're not getting enough winter chill hours to actually initiate flowering. They'll just kind of make it through in a dormant state and then come out and they don't really break flowers like they should. And they flower pretty early, like I said, early April, up to late March sometimes, depending on the cultivar. And then once they get through flowering, we usually harvest late June to early July for us here in Central Illinois. Up in Wisconsin, they'll start harvesting usually about mid-July. And for pollination, they are self-pollinated, and some wind can be it, but the early flowering means they're really reliant on native bees. And so honeybees can work as well. They recommend if you're doing honeybees, you put out 1 hive per acre. But I mean, I think your best bet is to try to maintain either in your rows some good early season pollinators and habitat for native bees, or at best would be to have a couple nearby sites that you have in native habitat for bees, for the native bees. And so those include even some of those smaller flies and stuff. And they do a really good job of that early pollination. And irrigation is really critical if you're interested in production. Currants are naturally kind of drought resistant, but you just won't get a yield, which for most people is going to be your biggest concern. And so you want to make sure that you have them grown with irrigation. We use the irrigation line. You can do a single line or double line system, but they need about 1 inch per week from bloom all the way through harvest. And after harvest, it's important to maintain a little bit of water as well. You don't need quite as much. 1 inch every 2 weeks is sufficient, but that helps them form, because they start forming their flower buds for the next season in the fall before they go dormant. And so you want to make sure you have enough water in the soil there for them to go through and to properly make their buds for the next season. Yeah, and it's best to use drip irrigation. Overhead irrigation can work, but depending on what variety you have, that can really start to encourage some of the foliar diseases like powdery mildew. And weed control, I think, in my opinion, for currants is the most critical issue that you're going to have. Outside of disease, outside of pests, weed control is the most critical. One, because of their growth habit, it can be difficult to eat both weed, and they have shallow roots. So even going through and using like a stirrup hoe to remove weeds, you will start to snag on some of those roots, and they're not a big fan of that. And so having adequate weed control is critical. In this little trial we had here, you can see that we used a black mulch and a black fabric mulch, and then also wood chips. Both of those are good options to use. The black fabric is really nice because you can apply it once, and as long as it's a good quality black fabric, you don't have to touch it again. And another option that some farmers are using is to use white fabric mulch, and that just keeps that soil a little bit cooler for those currants who are, like I mentioned, not a big fan of the heat in some of the areas. And that also keeps them from blooming as quickly in the springtime. But if not, the wood chip mulches are also a good option, and you just want to make sure that you're reapplying those yearly or every other year as needed. And this is a really nice picture I got from Bob Johnson of Nectar Flow Farms in Indiana. These are aronia berries with the black fabric mulch. And here you can really see these were planted at the same time. They're the same cultivar, but on the left there, he used a 6-foot weed barrier, and on the right was only a 3-foot. And you can see the size difference in these aronia berries. And like I said, same plantings and everything. It's all because of that weed exclusion. And so it's really easy to think about the weed control from above ground standpoint. You look at it and you're like, oh yes, the weeds are blocking out the sunlight or air movement from these berries. But the more critical issue is actually a below ground that you can't see. And so sometimes we like to think that we can just mow up underneath the berries. But even that, as you can see, will impact the above ground growth that those bushes are capable of doing. Because especially when it comes to grasses, those fibrous root systems will beat out any of our woody crops any day. They are just such a thick, dense, competitive, nutrient irrigation taker, space taker, and the plants can't balance out that ideal ratio of above ground to below ground biomass. And so this was just a really great picture that he sent me. Yeah. And here's from my own personal experiences, just a couple slides of shame here, and how quickly the weeds can go. This was 1 month difference, and we sprayed it out, we had it cleared out, and then within 1 month, those weeds were already completely taken over. And so that's where I argue that using those weed barriers, even outside of herbicides, are super critical. And here's another really great example of me showing up to work at one of our Wisconsin sites, realizing that the weeds had gotten out of control, and then spent the next 4 hours doing this little 1/10th or 1/20th of an acre's worth. It took forever. And when you're using even something like a weed whip or a weed whacker, especially when the currants are smaller, you're going to just knock them out. They are still really small. Those stems just get annihilated with even a string trimmer. And so that's why, especially during establishment, everything you can do for weed control is gonna save you and save you money, and I guess give you a sooner payout than normal. Here's just a list of some of the chemical options that we have. Currants aren't really a popular berry, so you don't find them too often on the labels for herbicides. But if you're interested, just send me an email after this, and I'd be happy to send this over to you, some of these resources. I guess what I will say, though, is that on this topic of chemical uses on herbicides, pre-emerges are what you want to be using. Post-emergence should be kind of a last resort, because getting in there and you hit them with Roundup, and it won't kill the plants if you hit them with Roundup, but they will be very upset and they might not produce as well. So moving on to some of the more fun things, there's other styles of production that you can do, including trellising. As I mentioned with the red currants and the white currants, they do really well with trellising, but the black currants can also do incredibly well, especially in U-pick operations. So you're not having people just knocking down your stems and your canes. This way, they're nice and supported. People can get to them in easy access. For pruning, the main goal of pruning is to maintain a nice open cup shape, similar to what you might find in like a peach tree. And so what you want is about 10 to 15 canes around the outside. And of those, you want a fair amount of those selections to be 1-year stems, because the currants will produce on that 1-year wood. So last year's growth, then that's where you're going to be getting a lot of your fruiting from. And as long as those 2- and 3-year-old canes have a lot of that new 1-year stems on it, those are also really nice to include. But one other option, and this is more commonly found with the hedgerow systems, is you can coppice. And so every 3 to 5 years, we're finding that for about 4 years is sort of that sweet spot. You can just mow the plants down completely to the base. And by doing so, you can rejuvenate them. You take your currants out of production for a year, but then you also are cutting down on your labor costs by, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but a lot. I'd say the majority of your labor is going to be coming into from pruning and then from harvest time. And so if you can knock out that pruning labor, then that's something that can be really nice. And so in a large operation, you'll commonly find farmers that will take out about 25% of their field every year as they rotate through. That will be coppiced years for those. And harvest, we at the university, because we have to get individual plant yields, we do hand harvesting. And this is not a bad option with currants, especially black currants. They grow really nicely along the stems. And so you can kind of shake the berries off with your hands. And we use this umbrella system. And so we put the umbrellas up underneath at the base of the currants, and then we can drop the berries directly into the umbrella. And the umbrellas have a little bit more of a flex to them than a hardened system. And so that kind of helps protect the berries a little bit better. And the berries are nice too, because they will hang on for quite a while after they're ready. And so they don't necessarily always ripen completely evenly, but as soon as you start to see berries dropping of being overripe, it's usually a good sign that that's a good time to go out there and harvest your berries. But if it's like a backyard production system, going out there and harvesting maybe 2 or 3 times as they become ripe is also a good option. So machine harvesting, though, is probably going to be your most common technique for harvesting these if you're in a commercial scale. And here it's 60 to 7% of labor needs, and you can get roughly 5 to 10 pounds per bush as expected yield. We're finding that to be a little high so far from what we've noticed, but our plants are still coming into maturity. And they do store very well in the freezer. We've had samples stored in the freezer for up to 1.5 years without really losing any of our nutraceutical benefits. And so here's hand harvest, and particularly for the white and red currants, it's pretty much your only option. You can do it individually. You can do it with a team of people. One person can hit one side of the plant, the other person can hit the other. It takes about roughly 170 billable hours per acre to hand harvest. So if you have anything over, a couple acres, you're going to be really running into some pretty extreme bills. Pneumatic shakers are another option here. Hopefully that sound's turned off. Nope. Okay. So the pneumatic shakers are another good option. Here's how we had set it up a couple years ago. We have these pull behind catchment systems, and we use these shakers that are actually olive shakers out of California. You need a 4-person crew for this. You need 2 people on either side to drive and carry both the air compressor for the pneumatics, as well as the extra bins then we can store the fruit into. And this cuts down the labor significantly. This is down to around 17 billable hours, so 10% of what we were doing by hand. And the nice thing too about this system is that we're able to get in between the trees. And so in our agroforestry systems here, this is a chestnut tree with a black currant underneath. We had bought this really nice machine harvester and we couldn't get down our rows. And so it was really sad. And so we came up with this new system. And so that it makes it really nice so you can get in some diverse situations for harvesting. And here's another kind of nice couple pictures. And we actually put them into little kiddie pools to actually, we used we already had the air compressor behind us, and then we could use air to actually blow out a lot of the debris in the leaves. The better option, if you have coming up to 10 to 30 acres plus, is to just invest in a nice machine harvester. This is an older video we took when the plants were still young. And so we normally you don't have to have a person here guiding them into the plant, but we were trying to get a single pass with the side harvester. And so we kind of had to maneuver it manually. But here you can see this cuts it down 6.75 billable hours per acre. And you can see this is just a really quick shaker. It doesn't necessarily twist. It's not the rotation as much as it is the shaking, the jostling of the berries. And it drops them into this conveyor. And then those conveyors move along and it goes through an air blower that then blows it out. And you have these nice clean berries that come out afterwards, which our workers are always happy to see. And there's 2 to 4 people. We like to have extra people on hand when we're doing harvest just to be on the safe side. But we have run this harvester with just the tractor driver and me in the back as an operator. And we've been able to do it with 2 people, which once again, that will cut down your billable hours total. And it's just a little bit you have to be a little more reliant on the weather being good enough to not be cooking berries as you drop them behind you. And so this was the Joanna 3. This is what we are using. I believe they're definitely on the Joanna 4, and if I remember correctly, they might even be on the Joanna 5. But there are these really nice shakers. You can get different attachments, these like little shaker header attachments that you can use for Aronia, or plenty of other options there. Oh. Okay, hopefully, can everyone still hear me? Okay, my headphones just died on me, so. So for pests, like I said, weeds are going to be your biggest issue with currants, but there are some pests to be concerned with, mainly disease. But many of these have already been selected to be resistant to some of these more popular diseases. And so white pine blister rust I already discussed, but this is an older series of currants that obviously is highly resistant. It comes off like Cheeto dust from the bottom of the plants. You'll find it in about August. This is American gooseberry powdery mildew. This one is also kind of concerning. This was our first year that we found it on the berries, actually, and we only were finding it on the berries and the red and white currants, but normally you get it on the leaves there, and also in the stem. You can kind of see it turns it into this wispy little end piece. But you'll find it as soon as, honestly, probably in a few weeks here, you might be able to start seeing it. And it'll go for quite a while after that. And so you can use horticultural oil. We use that primarily in the past to keep it at bay. It provides a protective barrier for the currants. But millstop, also known as potassium bicarbonate, has been found to be very useful in the control options. And you can apply millstop when it's above 90 degrees. Whereas horticultural oil, you don't want to apply it when it gets too hot outside. This disease here, currant cane dieback, is right now our most concerning disease that we have found. It wasn't really listed, and it wasn't really something that we had on our radar at all until we started planting out some of these newer varieties that we have found to be incredibly susceptible to it. And so what it does is it causes these stems to just die back. And you'll start seeing it now. The leaves will start shriveling up on individual stems. And usually by harvest time, you'll get these completely dead stems. And then within a season, you'll start to get these little pycnidia structures, these little black structures on the plants themselves. There's a nice good picture that you can see of it that you'll see on the tips. And that's how you know you have it. As a researcher, I was really excited. This is a disease they talked about in the 1920s, and then we banned currants and they disappeared. Incredibly bad for farmers, particularly for farmers planting out some of the newer varieties that might be susceptible to it. There's another picture of it just completely killing off the stems. This is what it kind of looks like coming up in the next couple of weeks. It'll start to turn yellow, chlorotic, and then it just completely dies off. So another one that we've discovered to be on the more concerning side of things is the four-line garden beetle. This is probably our most concerning of the beetles that we have here in central Illinois. And it causes these leaf blotches that at first I thought we were just getting leaf spot on varieties that were resistant. And then I realized that it was these little tiny beetles. They start off in this younger stage as these red beetles, and they mature to the right there with those more classic four lines that you see. We also sometimes have issues with some of the caterpillars. Here we have the giant silkworms that will pop up. They can defoliate a plant within a day or two, so they're very concerning, but they usually don't come on until harvest time. So I really don't feel too bad. I mean, they're nice. They're a nice little native here, but the Japanese beetles are really concerning. They don't tend to go for the black currants unless they're very hungry. Otherwise, they will go for a few of the red currant varieties that have sort of the softer leaves. And hail damage. This was last year. We got to discover this one. The currants do not do well with hail. We had this about a week before harvest, and that shredded some of the plants and knocked off a lot of fruit. And there are some nutrient deficiencies, currants, especially if they're growing in a higher pH soil. In the spring, when it gets really wet, we start to notice some iron and magnesium deficiencies. And you can treat that with some foliar sprays that have that. There's a product called Micro 500 that we've used a few times successfully to help with some of that chlorosis that you see. But yeah, one of the concerns as well, there's some leaf spot damage that it can be concerning. That's more of a concern on the red and white currants. And just one last little special use that I like to toss in because it was so incredible to see. This was in the Netherlands with their trellis currants. They had chickens running in between them. And I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. The chickens did a really good job of keeping out the weeds underneath the currants. And the currants did a good job of protecting the chickens from the hawks. So it's just a nice little option there that, especially for the backyard home gardeners, the chickens do like currants. And so this is the currant variety trial that we have in Urbana. I'll just give a couple bit of, it's still, so this, we're going into year 5, and year 5 is what we'd consider a mature currant. So this is only for year 3 and year 4 yield averages. This is at the pounds per acre equivalents if grown in our style, which was every 2-foot planting. And so you can see we have some clear winners here. Some of these varieties are not available for release yet, like the Chica Moose variety, which is right here. That's a McGinnis variety. It's still not available for release, but we're working with the breeders right now to hopefully in the next couple of years have that one available. But some of these are available at the time. Blackcomb is one of them, and I believe Nickel is now available. And some of these, like Tibin, these are from Polish varieties. Those are nice ones as well that are showing some good promise. And this was just, so we're doing a shade trial. We're comparing it with shade. So this was, I think, a really good example just showing where the red and black currants kind of stand individually. The red currants really, really like shade for the most part. There's some varieties that aren't a big fan of it, but a few of these varieties just they love the shade. And the black currants are some good varieties as well that if you're considering growing these in sort of a shady backyard environment, this is with 65% shade. There are some good variety options for you to plant out. So with that, I will take the questions and comments. I think the chat box might have had some going ons there.
Yeah, we do have a few questions here. The first one is, do they blossom at the same time as apples?
Earlier, yeah. If not the same time. I would say they start to flower about a week before the apples do, roughly around the same time as the peaches do, and they'll go about the same length of time those apples. So yeah. And I've look at the chat, but there is an edible native blackcurrant. There's a couple different options there. There's the clove currant, which is edible, but not necessarily always recommended for eating. And there is the American blackcurrant, which is also kind of that same boat. It hasn't really, there has been no breeding efforts on it at a commercial scale, but there are natives that you could be planting out that do provide, you know, human food, but more better probably is for wildlife. And so how do we decide when to harvest? So we only harvest once from our fields, only because we we only have so much labor. And so we really can only do it at one single point. And we also aren't selling our currants, or at least the ones that we harvest from these trials, we don't sell. And so we're not as concerned with having all ripe berries. They're not going to the store where people want them to be completely ripe. And most of our stuff, if we do sell it, it goes to processing. And so having some underripe berries isn't a concern. And so we make the decision based on fruit drop personally. You'll start seeing a few that will get to that ripe stage, or once they get to the full 95% of the bush is ready to go, that's what we do. We pull the trigger and we harvest. But that tends to coincide with a fruit drop kind of time period where you start to see the berries falling down on the ground. And then we say, okay, now it's time to go out there and harvest these currants. And fertilizer recommendations. So we recommend about 100 pounds nitrogen per acre once they're mature. Up to that point, we do about 20 pounds per year. At year 1, 40 pounds year 2, 60 pounds year 3, 80 pounds year 4, and then the full rate about year 5. And you can kind of adjust that based on how your currants are responding and at what your natural soils are. But the general recommendation is about 100 pounds per nitrogen. And for post-harvest, the biggest thing is, especially because in the Midwest, you're harvesting in July, that's going to be your hottest point in the year. So our harvesting protocols are, we don't harvest past noon on most days because we want to make sure that we can get them into the cooler as quick as possible. And if you have a forced air cooler first, that's your best option, is to run it through a forced air cooler and then transfer those into your actual long-term storage cooler, or freeze them immediately. And we also have used, we also rinse them with some like vegetable or fruit rinse aid. We do a dunk with those. And so we'll dunk them in after harvest just to clean them out. Let some of the bad berries float up, any of the insects or debris float out, and we can skim that all out. And then we pull it out, and that's when it's ready to kind of air dry for a little bit, and then we freeze it at that point. And let's see, how do you see marketing black currants, getting people excited about the products? That's something that we're working on. So we worked with our local breweries, and we had one product that came out this year. If you're in the Champaign-Urbana region, the Blind Pig has a beer out that you can find at most stores. That's a sour beer that they made with black currants. But we've also seen the products being used a lot of times in the jams around here. I think the flavor on the currants is as much of a I don't know, way of attracting people. It's a really unique taste, and it seems that most people, once they try them, they kind of want to see it a little more often. We've seen them in gelatos before and in ice creams. It's just a really unique flavor that's I think most people enjoy it. So that's honestly your best bet, is to go out and have a product that you can, show people at the co-op or at the farmers markets and say, hey, this is a blackcurrant and it's good, and it can be made into some really nice products. And yeah, animal fertilizer, goat bedding, all those are good options as well. You just want to make sure that it's well composted before putting it on. It's best not to put that on fresh. And you also want to make sure that you are very cognizant of not applying that when it comes close to harvest time, and preventing that fruit, because the stems do like to hang out pretty low to the ground. And you just want to make sure you're not getting any sort of contaminants from using animal fertilizer. But once it's well composted, that's a really great option. And it works really well putting that down and then putting over like a wood chip mulch or fabric mulch. That's a really nice way as well to kind of fertilize the currants there. And how many years individual plants can bear fruit. And so it's that first year that's gonna be off. So you coppice them. That first year is just a regrowth stage. That second year, you get kind of a half yield. And then that following year 3 to year 4 is when you really start to get a pretty good solid yield. And we've actually noticed a year 4 yields to produce higher than our annual pruning yields. And so that was sort of exciting finding for ourselves. And so for powdery mildew, for organic, we've actually only used organic products. We haven't used any of the conventional products for powdery mildew. And we've had pretty good success, especially because we're growing a variety called Consort, which is very susceptible to powdery mildew. And so what we do for that one is a mineral oil, and that you want to start applying the mineral oil before you start seeing the powdery mildew. So if you know you have a susceptible variety, you start applying it. This also works for like squash is another really common one that gets powdery mildew. You just want to make sure that you're putting it on before. It's only a barrier to prevent the spores from landing and getting into the leaf. Once you have it, that's where that Millstop product is really nice. Millstop is a potassium bicarbonate, and that one adjusts the pH so it's outside the realm of the fungus where it wants to be living at, and it will actually, if you have it present on the leaves, you can use that to then get it off the leaves, and that does a really. We've been pretty happy with that. If you want just like a really basic squirt bottle for your plants inside the house, a little bit of vegetable oil with a little bit of baking soda, mix that up and spritz that on your leaves, and it's essentially the same thing. But there's organic products out there that are way better, and our concentration is about 1 to 2%. And I'm glad you like my bent hoops. Those took a while. My master's work involved I used Gothic frames for those hoop structures, and then going into my PhD work, we were tripling the amount of hoops that we had, and I ended up using those are all hand bent. So that was all a lot of conduit. Those have taken some time, and this slideshow doesn't have it. I have some really good pictures of them getting bent from snowfall collapsing them. We had a tornado come through at one point; those collapsed them. I've spent a lot of time in those in those hoops. So that's all conduit. For the ones that are on the wind side, we use 1-inch conduit. On the ones that are farther in and have a little more of a wind block, we use 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch. But yeah, so that setup is just a standard conduit bender with that we just bend those shapes, those hoops with. So what you might find in organic vegetable production for those low tunnels, we're using the same thing as that. But if you're interested, send me an email. I'd love to show you my actual drawings and schematics on those. And Greg, if you want to email me some pictures of Josta berries, I will gladly put them in my presentations, and I will credit you for that. So, and anyone else too, if you guys got Josta berry pictures or currant pictures, or even Aronia pictures with really nice weed control, I welcome all pictures to see any good food products that you find in the area, and any sort of up and coming businesses. I didn't have a picture of it, but out in the Northeast now, there's a cassis company. Creme de Cassis is a liqueur that's made from black currants. And so they just started that. I think this year is our first year with releases. And so any cool products you find, send them my way. I love to see them, and I love to share them and try to get the current market, make it a thing. I will say the creme de cassis is a great option if you're growing currants. It's very easy. You can use vodka or brandy, and you soak the berries in it for 1 to 3 months. Strain, add some simple syrup, and you have a very delectable dessert drink that you can add to champagne or even to sparkling water. So there's some really fun options there. Are there any questions I missed? I think I got them all, Bill.
Yeah, I think you did. That's good timing.
Yeah, feel free. I also didn't include it. My Twitter or my Instagram handle there, Currant Jams, all one word. Feel free to like and subscribe below. I like to post a lot of pictures of the currants on there. So, and I tend to try to address as many questions as possible to people. That's the one. Yep. Hashtag Currant Jams. Most flavorful varieties. Honestly, that's up to public opinion. I let me go back here. So just like the purple ones are our black currants there, just to help people get an idea there. But of those lists there, I would argue that actually the most flavorful is the consort or coronet. People tend to hate those ones. The European juice market doesn't allow them to be used, but they have the strongest flavor and they're the most healthy. They're just so nutrient dense and flavor dense that some people don't like them, but they are the most flavorful. Outside of that, Tassus and Whistler are some of the newer releases that I've had. My friends' kids they ate an entire bowl of them. I brought a bowl from work and I was like, okay, these are for like the group party, and the one kid just sat down and ate the whole bowl. So if that's a sign of flavorful, I would say that the kids liked it. That's a good sign. But yeah, like Greg said, all of them are good. I think you're gonna have a hard time finding a blackcurrant that doesn't taste good. And Midwest suppliers to buy them from, just off the top of my head, Indiana Berry Company is one of them we've bought from. My family has. There's plenty of other ones that I just don't have on the top of my head. And the McGinnis varieties are soon to be available, I think, through a new nursery supplier within the next year or so. I think there are some issues with the coronavirus and a transition phase there, but hopefully within the next year or so, those will be available. The Chica Moose releases, I honestly, I don't know how long patents take, so they take some time. But I think what I'd heard from the breeder was that they're hoping within the next couple of years to have these newer varieties released and available to the public. Yeah, hopefully everyone got some good info. And once again, if you didn't get enough, feel free to send me an email or whatever, and I'll be happy to talk some more about currants. My family hates to listen to it, so I mean, if someone can listen to me talk about currants, I'll be very happy. So, and okay, email is here, so you can email me there. I also have now a Savanna Institute email. It's just my first name, Eric, at savannainstitute.com or .org. And so that's another way you can reach me. I'm all over the place.
Okay, well, that's great. It's right at 7. It looks like everyone appreciated the information. So yeah, we've recorded this, so this will be available in the future on the Savanna Institute website. And yeah, if you're intrigued by what Eric shared, keep following us, because we will have more field days and webinars. We're going to try to help develop markets. So part of what we're doing with this grant are tasting evaluations with chefs, which we hope will lead to product development. And then we're also looking into the juice market and other markets that farmers can pursue. And we hope to be able to scale up black currants as a crop so more people can grow them. So this is just the beginning, and we look forward to the next 2 years of working on this.
Yep.
So I think with that, we'll end for now, but thanks everyone for attending, and thanks, Eric. That was great.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.